historic storm that is going to be coming ashore in the Florida Panhandle today.
October 2018.
Hurricane Michael is making its landfall in Bay County.
Deep in the Western Caribbean, a seemingly harmless disturbance, just another tropical system that few initially believed would be anything more than a sheared mess, is taking shape. In just a few days, this broad area of showers and thunderstorms would transform over the warm waters of the Eastern Gulf, becoming a monster that would put every lesson Florida has learned to the ultimate test.
First responders, police or fire, will not be able to get to you. So that's why if we ask you to leave, you need to leave, because if you need help, we won't be able to help you.
Packing 160-mile-per-hour winds, Michael cemented its title as the most powerful hurricane to ever strike the Panhandle and became the most recent Category 5 landfall in the United States. In this final chapter of our three-part journey through Florida's encounters with Category 5 giants, we step back into the moment when the Panhandle faced its day of reckoning, to look back at the fury, the devastation, and the lasting scars the storm left behind.
So Mexico Beach is getting the full brunt of the eastern eye wall.
I'm CJ, and this is Florida Man Weather. For several days, computer models had been hinting that a system could form in the Southwest Caribbean from an active Central American gyre. The CAG serves as a seedling of unsettled weather and vorticity that can go on to form into hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin, especially in the early and late portions of the hurricane season. Meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center would track the fledgling system. On October 2nd, in their 2 a.m. tropical weather outlook, they would give the system a 20% chance of forming into a tropical storm. Over the following days, NHC meteorologists would watch on as thunderstorms flared in bursts, only to be shredded apart by the hostile upper-level winds. Moderate wind shear would bite at the fragile circulation, peeling away the developing rain bands and keeping the center ragged and exposed. The atmosphere just seemed intent on smothering the storm before it could take its first breath. Yet, beneath those churning cloud tops, the storm refused to collapse. Infrared satellites would catch flashes of cold cloud tops, evidence of deep convection trying to organize against all of these odds. And with the system's proximity to land, and the computer models now consistently showing that the system could pose a threat to the continental United States, the National Hurricane Center initiated advisories on potential Tropical Cyclone 14 on October 6th. And then issued tropical storm warnings for western Cuba and tropical storm watches for the eastern Yucatan Peninsula. Early the next morning, the Hurricane Center would note that the system had finally fought its way across an invisible but pivotal threshold, becoming Tropical Depression 14. And with computer models now locking onto a track that would bring the system into the Florida Panhandle as an intensifying hurricane, the National Hurricane Center issued hurricane watches for portions of the Florida Gulf Coast from the Perdido River over to the Suwannee River, and storm surge watches were issued from Navarre Beach to Anna Maria Island. Most counties in the Panhandle then followed suit with ordering local emergencies and evacuations in their coastal areas as residents began preparing themselves and their homes for a direct hit. Later that morning, the NHC would release a special update advisory at 11:55 a.m. Central Time, noting that TD14 had now strengthened further into a tropical storm and was finally given a name, Michael. Meanwhile, overhead of the fledgling system, colossal atmospheric forces began to set the stage for what would come next. A vast dome of high pressure was sprawled across the eastern seaboard, its southern flank pulling Michael inexorably toward the north-northwest. But in the days before landfall, the balance would shift. A mid-latitude trough would stretch eastward across the United States, its powerful southwesterly flow taking hold and steering the storm on a sharper, deadlier course, northeast, directly toward the Florida Panhandle. When Michael emerged into the open Gulf, it found itself over a cauldron. The waters here weren't just warm, they were ablaze with heat, running 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit above seasonal averages. And this was no ordinary fuel source. It was the equivalent of a vast oceanic battery waiting to be drained. And over the next 48 hours, Michael would undergo explosive intensification. The Gulf's anonymously warm surface pumped immense latent heat into the storm, while the once disruptive wind shear would finally disappear, allowing Michael's core to align perfectly from the sea surface to the upper atmosphere. Walls of thunderstorms would rise higher and stronger, wrapping tighter around the eye. By the pre-dawn hours of October 10th, the storm had exploded from a modest Category 1 into a towering beast, right on the edge of a Category 5, and was taking aim at the Florida Panhandle, a region of the state that had never in recorded history experienced a storm stronger than a Category 3. On the morning of October 10th, 2018, the Florida Panhandle braced for a storm, but not this storm. In the hours before landfall, the Gulf laid eerily calm, its surface a shimmering mask that hid the explosive energy beneath. And far offshore, a Category 4 hurricane, its eye a perfect circle, its eyewall an unbroken fortress of cloud, spun with deadly purpose. Although it was operationally labeled as a Category 4, we now know that the storm had reached a staggering 160 miles per hour, its central pressure an astonishing 919 millibars, making Michael a colossal Category 5 monster. From orbit, NOAA's GOES-16 satellite would capture the storm in surreal clarity. Towering convective bursts boiling up around the eye, shadows stretching across the Gulf from cloud tops higher than Mount Everest. In Hurricane Hunter aircraft, they would slice through the walls of wind and rain, measuring 175 mile-per-hour winds at flight level, their instruments actually vibrating from the violence in the eye wall. And even in those final moments before landfall, Michael was still gathering itself for one last surge of strength. Finally, at 12:30 p.m. Central Time, Michael would make landfall in Bay County, Florida, between Tyndall Air Force Base and Mexico Beach. It was a strike without precedent for the region, an unrelenting Category 5, the most powerful storm to ever strike the Florida Panhandle. From the south-facing beaches of Cape San Blas to the flat expanse of Mexico Beach, the world would disappear into a gray wall. The wind, that arrived first, not in gusts, but as a constant, deafening roar. Trees would bow to impossible angles, then were snapped like dry twigs. The air was filled with the hiss and howl of millions of airborne fragments. Roof shingles, sliding panels, branches, shards of glass, and entire billboards that were wrenched from their posts. Then came the surge. Driven by Michael's low pressure and ferocious onshore winds, the Gulf rose as if inhaled by the storm itself, then was propelled forward like a jet blast of water 9 to 14 feet high. Waves would ride atop the surge, breaking into second-story rooms of beachfront buildings. Entire blocks of Mexico Beach were erased. Structures were torn from their foundations, swept inland, or ground to splinters against their neighbors as the coastline was reshaped in real time. At Tyndall Air Force Base, hangars designed to shelter fighter jets would crumple under the onslaught, their steel frames groaning before giving way. Radar imagery would show the eye wall crossing directly over the installation, winds screaming past 150 miles per hour. Every building on base sustained damage, and some, they lost their entire roofs within seconds. Panama City, one of the most populous areas in the Florida Panhandle, was trapped in the storm's eye wall. Here, the wind turned the urban landscape into a shredding machine. Roofs were pried open, exposing interiors to torrents of rain. Brick facades peeled away, and traffic lights, they twisted like paper clips, and 2x4s were hurled through the air like missiles. Survivors described the storm's sound as a combination of a freight train, a jet engine, and a primal scream, a sound that those survivors would not soon forget. The storm's swift forward speed meant that it could carry its ferocity from the coast far inland before friction and terrain could take their toll. By the time the eye passed over Mariana, nearly 60 miles from the coast, Michael was still a Category 3 hurricane, with sustained winds around 115 miles per hour. The city's historic core, a collection of century-old brick buildings, would just shudder under the gusts that ripped cornices from rooftops and sent debris pinwheeling down the streets. Across Jackson County, the groves of pecans and stands of longleaf pines fell in tangled mats, and the county's vast cotton fields were flattened into sodden white sheets. Crossing the state line into Georgia around sunset, Michael remained remarkably intact. In Seminole County, 80 miles from the coast, the winds in Michael's core raged up to 115 miles per hour. The inland forests became wind tunnels, their canopies snapping, the scent of pine sap filling the air, mingled with the sharp tang of torn soil. The agricultural heart of southwest Georgia took a direct hit. Pecan orchards, some generations old, were just uprooted. Peanut harvests, poised for picking, were left rotting in flooded furrows. Farm silos collapsed like tin cans under the relentless push of the wind. Even sturdy grain elevators shuddered, their metal skins peeled away in sheets. Michael's structure held together well into the night. As it plowed northeast across Georgia, the hurricane force winds gradually eased, but tropical storm force winds still extended outwards hundreds of miles. In Albany, Georgia, trees fell across nearly every road and radio towers swayed under the assault. Rain bands spiraled across the state, delivering bursts of torrential downpours. Yet Michael's speed kept rainfall totals lower than they might have been. It was wind, not water, that would define the storm's inland wrath throughout the state of Georgia. Finally, nearly 24 hours after making landfall in Florida, Michael had weakened to a tropical storm on the early morning of October 11th, with its center now pushing into the Carolinas. Even though it was now so far from the coast, the storm retained a tightly wound core, and its wind field interacted with the complex topography of the Piedmont and the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains to produce damaging wind gusts and torrential rainfall. In North Carolina, streams and rivers already swollen from the recent rains became raging torrents under fresh runoff, triggering flash flood emergencies in cities like Charlotte and Raleigh. As the storm moved out of the Carolinas and over Virginia, Michael's rain shield also expanded eastward. Tornado warnings flared across portions of the mid-Atlantic as embedded supercells spun within its outer bands. Along the coastal plain, tropical storm force winds funneled water into the lower Chesapeake Bay, raising tides in vulnerable communities. By October 12th, its center was racing off the Delmarva Peninsula towards open water. By the time the storm cleared the U.S. East Coast, Michael was accelerating northeast, absorbed into the westerlies, and it sped toward the open Atlantic at over 25 miles per hour, leaving in its wake a continuous swath of hurricane and tropical storm force impacts stretching from the Florida Gulf Coast to the barrier islands of the Delmarva Peninsula. When the winds finally calmed and the last rain bands turned into a purple and gray October sky, the Florida Panhandle emerged into a silence that was almost unbearable. It was not the peace of a passing storm, but instead the stillness of absence. The absence of familiar landmarks, of roofs, of power humming through the wires, of the very shape of life as it had been the day before. From Cape San Blas to Mexico Beach, from Panama City inland through Mariana and into Georgia, Hurricane Michael had left a swath of utter devastation. What had been a vibrant Gulf Coast morning less than 24 hours before was now a quagmire of ruin. Streets were choked with debris, the air heavy with the resinous scent of shattered pine forests, and the atmosphere was an unnerving silence, broken only by the hum of generators and the distant whine of chainsaws and the occasional thump of collapsing walls. Mexico Beach, a small, close-knit town of pastel homes and vacation rentals on Florida's forgotten coast, had been the storm's bullseye. Here, 85% of the structures were damaged or destroyed, and the storm surge, 14 feet in places, had scoured the landscape completely clean. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by bare concrete slabs and tangled piles of lumber and twisted rebar. Cars and boats laid upended blocks from where they had been moored the morning before. Survivors returned to find only fragments of their former lives. A photo album lodged in a tree, a door from their home resting against the remains of a neighbor's foundation. Some wept openly. Others stood motionless, staring at where their houses had been, unable to speak. Just west of Mexico Beach, Tyndall Air Force Base lay in tatters. Every building had sustained damage. Aircraft hangars were torn open, their steel skeletons twisted. Barracks were uninhabitable, offices stood open to the sky, and millions of dollars worth of equipment was damaged or destroyed. The base's once proud tree line was reduced to ragged stumps. In Panama City, the skyline was jagged where roofs had been ripped away. Traffic lights dangled from severed cables. Businesses were gutted, their interiors littered with glass, drywall, and merchandise tossed around like leaves. The damage here was as chaotic as it was complete. $18.4 billion in losses across Florida alone. Much of it was concentrated in Bay County. However, Michael's violence was not confined to the Gulf Coast. Its winds remained at major hurricane force all the way into Georgia, leaving the Panhandle's inland counties to bear a destruction few had imagined possible so far from the coast. In Jackson and Calhoun counties, entire forests had been flattened, and the timber industry alone suffered catastrophic losses. More than 5 million acres of forest were damaged or destroyed in Florida, and an economic blow of $1.3 billion. Farmers walked through fields where cotton crops, once white with near-ready harvest, lay beaten into the mud. Pecan orchards, decades in the making, were uprooted in minutes. In Mariana, historic brick buildings that had stood for more than a century were roofless, with debris clogging the streets. Across the state line, Michael was the first storm to directly strike Georgia as a major hurricane since the 1890s. The destruction the storm had left behind would bear generational scars through these rural, small farming towns. Georgia's agricultural losses soared into the billions. Cotton stripped from plants, peanuts rotting in flooded rows, and pecan groves lost. In Seminole County, Georgia, 99% of homes had suffered damage. Even in southeast Alabama, the state's famed wiregrass region was not spared Michael's wrath. The area suffered heavy losses, especially for cotton farmers. Other losses included peanuts, corn, soybeans, and timber, with damages to fencing, poultry houses, and irrigation systems. All told, the storm would leave $204 million in damage in Alabama. The sheer reach of the storm, from beachfront condos to backcountry barns, made recovery a shared struggle across the tri-state region. Official counts would place the U.S. death toll at 16 direct fatalities attributed to Michael, most of which occurred in Florida, and with an additional 43 indirect fatalities. But those numbers only hit at the true human cost. These indirect deaths attributed to the storm came from heat stress in homes left sweltering without power, from carbon monoxide poisoning as desperate residents ran generators in enclosed spaces, from accidents during cleanup, and from medical emergencies made fatal by the collapse of communications and transportation networks. More than 375,000 Floridians were ordered to evacuate before the landfall. Thousands who stayed were left homeless afterwards, and shelters would overflow, some for weeks. In rural areas where homes lay miles from the main roads, it was days before first responders could reach everyone, and over 1 million power customers across the Southeast lost electricity. In some Panhandle communities, the lights would stay out for months, as in some regions, the entire electrical grid would need to be rebuilt. Cell towers had been toppled, and entire counties were cut off from the outside world. The roads, they fared little better. US 98 was fractured and washed out in several places along the coast, and on Cape San Blas, the storm surge carved new inlets, permanently altering the peninsula and leaving parts of the St. Joseph Peninsula State Park accessible only by boat. The economic wounds were also deep and varied. The fishing and oyster industries in Apalachicola Bay, already under strain, were dealt a near fatal blow. Oyster beds were almost entirely wiped out, taking with them the livelihoods of countless fishermen and processing workers. Tourism, the lifeblood for towns like Mexico Beach and Panama City Beach, vanished overnight. Hotels were gutted, beaches were buried under piles of storm debris, and piers collapsed into the Gulf. Even after the winds were gone, Michael's presence would linger everywhere. In Mexico Beach, vacant lots stretched like missing teeth along the shoreline, with only a handful of modern, storm-fortified homes still standing, as lonely reminders of what once was. Inland, the change was quieter, but no less jarring. The familiar canopy of pines that had defined the Panhandle's horizons was stripped away, leaving the landscape exposed and strange. I didn't fully understand the scale of that loss until May 2019, when my fiance and I drove west through the Panhandle on I-10, headed to my cousin's wedding in Houston. As soon as we crossed into what was unbeknownst to us at the time, the storm's damage path, the sight left us absolutely stunned. It took only a few moments of audible wonder between us, but after, we realized what we were seeing. It was the first time her and I truly grasped how profoundly Michael had scarred the land, and how those scars would remain long after the storm itself had passed. Before Michael, the Florida Panhandle, long cherished as the Forgotten Coast, was a world unto itself, a place where the rhythms of life followed the tides, where pine forests met sugar-white beaches, and where livelihoods rested on agriculture, tourism, and the steady heartbeat of military bases. Its towns were small, but its bonds were airtight. For generations, people here had known the hiss of tropical rain and the howl of passing storms. Hurricanes came, yes, but never this. Never the raw, unrelenting force that would bear down in October 2018. In living memory, no storm stronger than a Category 3, much less a Category 5, had crossed this stretch of coastline. In fact, the most recent major hurricane, Hurricane Dennis, was a Category 3 that had struck over a decade prior. That absence of experience with violent hurricanes bred a quiet certainty. When Michael gathered strength offshore, many simply just could not imagine the force of what was coming. When Michael approached, much of the Panhandle's built environment stood unprepared for what the 160-mile-per-hour winds and the 14-foot wall of water could do. Older homes built in eras of lesser codes and lesser storms lined the shoreline, and development patterns hugged the water's edge, trusting dunes and pine breaks as a first line of defense. Michael would erase those illusions, however, in a matter of hours. Florida's building codes were born from tragedy, rewritten after the state's last Category 5 struck South Florida in 1992 and exposed the fatal flaws in construction standards. The Florida Building Code of 2002 was amongst the strongest in the nation, and Michael would be its harshest trial. The results were clear. In devastated towns like Mexico Beach, newer, code-compliant structures often withstood the wind, while older homes were ripped to their slabs. One house in particular became a symbol of what could be. Known as the Sand Palace, its pale walls stood defiantly amongst miles of ruin. The home had been built above and beyond even the FBC's most stringent rules. Concrete pilings sunk 40 feet deep, insulated concrete walls, a hip roof to deflect wind, minimal overhangs to prevent uplift. The extra cost? 15 to 20% more for the structural system, amounting to less than 10% of the overall home. The payoff? Minor repairs in the aftermath of a Category 5, while neighboring properties were reduced to empty concrete slabs. The message was stark. Resilience is possible, but it requires foresight and the will to invest in it. On the ground, the work of recovery was relentless. State programs such as Rebuild Florida steered over $735 million into workforce training, infrastructure repair, and housing. Relief organizations set up shelters, served millions of meals, and brought medicine to communities where hospitals lay crippled. In parking lots and temporary tents, health centers resumed care, patching not just the bodies, but the frayed fabric of everyday life. And through it all were quiet acts of quiet heroism. Neighbors sharing generators, strangers feeding one another from improvised kitchens, a firefighter walking 12 miles with a chainsaw just to clear a path to allow others to help. The challenges were colossal. Panama City alone spent more than $80 million hauling away mountains of debris. Small towns struggled to navigate the maze of federal reimbursement. Families lived for months in FEMA trailers, while insurance disputes and job losses piled hardship upon hardship. It was here that a crucial truth emerged. Speed is not the same as strength. Rapid recovery could rebuild what was lost, but it rebuilt it exactly as it was. But if it rebuilt it exactly as it was, the same vulnerabilities would stand, waiting for the next storm. Resilient recovery meant taking the harder road, raising foundations, hardening grids, securing redundant water supplies, and building a culture of preparedness that could withstand a storm like Michael again. Michael was more than a hurricane. It was a turning point. The numbers alone, 160-mile-per-hour winds, a central pressure of 919 millibars, and a storm surge of 14 feet tell a story of extremes, but they cannot capture the human cost. Families on their knees in the wreckage, searching for photographs, the silence of streets once filled with life, the grief of being forgotten after the news crews packed up and their cameras were trained on a new story. Even now, almost 6 years later, the wounds inflicted by Michael remain. The forests still show their scars and broken tree lines. Empty slabs still dot the coast where beachfront homes once stood. Yet, amongst those scars, there is evidence of renewal. New houses rise, taller, stronger, and ready for their next storm. Schools and town halls open their doors, and fighter jets once again thunder from the runways of Tyndall Air Force Base. And the people, those who weathered the storm and those who came back, carry with them the day Michael changed everything. Not as a symbol of defeat, but as proof of their endurance. Michael's legacy is forever etched into the Panhandle's coastline, skyline, and memories of those who endured it. Written in splintered wood, twisted steel, and stories shared from neighbor to neighbor. It redrew maps and rewrote lives. Yet it also defined the measure of what a place and its people can withstand. The storm's warning to Florida was unmistakable. Resilience cannot be improvised in the shadow of a landfall. It must be woven into the fabric of a community long before the skies darken. With that lesson, also comes a promise. Once resilience is earned, no wind, no wave, no storm can erase the will to rise again. On the so-called forgotten coast, the people proved that and have vowed that they will be forgotten no longer. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out my channel. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss more content like these. Thanks again, CJ, Florida Man Weather.